Good morning.
Good morning.
So nice to see you all. So this week I'd like to continue speaking about the Gate of Sweet Nectar, which in our sutra book I mentioned last week is referred to as the Ambrosia Gate. That's the standard translation from the Soto school, but Gate of Sweet Nectar is a little bit more poetic, I think. It's nice. And that ambrosia is usually food, and the nectar is like nectar, right? So I prefer that translation, Gate of Sweet Nectar. And this is a teaching that we receive and enact rituals in relationship to this all year long. But during the month of October, there's a special focus placed on this practice that culminates in a ceremony called Segaki or Osegaki, which will happen next Sunday. And that's why I'm spending a couple Sundays talking about that. And it's one of the most colorful and loud and rambunctious ceremonies that we do at the temple. And so it usually catches people's attention, which is great. That's enough. But also to go inside of what the teaching about Osegaki is and try to understand a little bit about what we're doing with that ritual work and how it applies to our life for all of October, all of the year, all of a life, all of many lives, because there is a real central teaching in this ritual work. Last week I was spending quite a bit of time talking about the importance of spirit or spirits, and that in a scientific materialist worldview, which all of us have grown up to, at least to a certain extent, mostly the talk of spirit has been relegated to just fantasy, or at the best, maybe like a psychological phenomena. And so some people take them seriously in the sense that they're like a metaphor for something that's happening psychologically. But that's about as far as it goes. Now, I know here in Eugene, there's a lot more woo-woo than there's a lot of places. So I don't mean to say that that's how you regard them. But in general, I would say that is true. And as we come to Buddhist teachings, it's important for us to remember that this is not just a psychological exercise. It's not reducible to these other forms of explanation that we have, that there is a living body of tradition, there's a living spiritual tradition called Buddhism, which has its own terms, has its own framework, and that we need to encounter it on that level as well, not only interpret it. Although the interpretation is helpful, that's how the roots get in the ground, and a culture is infected with the truth. So part of what I was getting at is that spirit is so important because it invites us to a world that is not so easily divided. That in the kind of rational materialist world, we just take it for granted that there are things, and we're one of those things, and usually we're the subject in a world of objects. And that way of operating is so central to just our assumption about what's going on all the time. I'm a me, you're a you, and we're related to each other. But when we start to talk about spirit, it opens up another kind of door where it's very slippery. We're not really sure. There's no objects anymore. It's a kind of face of the interpenetration of existence, the mutuality of living, which we can see in a material sense, like none of us can be alive without receiving food as nourishment, for example. And we can acknowledge that we are relying upon all of these other beings for our life to exist. That makes sense, right? Like we've got to eat, and we're eating other things. Right? So we can get it on that material sense, but what I'm saying here is there's a spiritual sense to this too. And that when we take rituals and teachings that talk about spirits just on their own terms, it allows us a way to work with that, which is very different than the way that we tend to work with things. It's a world of no gap, a world where everything totally touches everything else. And that's very important because that's where healing happens. That we can do fixing in a world of subjects and objects, but there's a lot of healing that can't happen there. And healing is something more, here I'm saying something more subtle, more maybe immediate and close than fixing. And so I told the story last week, it's a very famous story of Enku, Blazing Mouth, this is the origin story of the Segaki ceremony. And someone asked me this week, they said, isn't there another story about a monk who's looking for his mom who was in a hell realm, hungry ghost realm? Yes, that's another story. And that's also a wonderful story, gets told around Osegaki. That story and the story that I tend to tell both have to do with the origins of a festival called Obon in Japan, which is where the Segaki usually happens. And the Ananda story with Blazing Mouth really is the origin of the Segaki part. And this other story is the origin of Obon, which is a time where the kind of the technical, I don't know if technical's right, the teaching on it is it's when the Lord of Hell lets everybody out for a day or a week. And that's a good time to get your ancestors out of a jam. And so in Obon, what happens is people light a fire to guide the spirits of their ancestors to the graveyard or to their home, and then they make offerings to them, but offerings that then they ask them to make offerings, which I'll talk a little bit about today. And it's a merit building time in which helps the spirits of ancestors be released from a cycle of suffering of some kind. So this is all very tied together. But in this story, Ananda is deep in meditation. He and the other renunciate Sangha are staying in a retreat outside of Kapilavastu, and one night, while he's deep in meditation, he's visited by Blazing Mouth, who is the king of the hungry ghosts. And Blazing Mouth says to Ananda, Ananda, in 3 days, you will lose your life. And Ananda says, why? Good question. If a hungry ghost appears to you, you might want to ask them this. And they will always give you the same answer. It's your karma. Right? And Ananda says, well, isn't there anything I can do about it? And I'm giving you the very short version. Okay? And Enku says, nope, there's nothing you can do about it. This is your karma. And he says, are you sure? And he says, well, there is one thing, but it's impossible to do. And he says, well, what is it? And he says, well, you have to satiate me. You have to feed me. You have to release me from the form of a hungry ghost. And not only me, you have to feed every hungry ghost in the realm of the hungry ghosts and free them all. And if you could do that, you would overcome your karma and you would not have to lose your life. And so Ananda goes to the Buddha. Enku disappears. He goes to the Buddha and he tells him the story. And Buddha says, don't fear. Actually, this is possible. You can satiate hungry ghosts. You can fill them up. You can liberate them from their hunger. And I learned this method from Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of compassion, when I abided in Tushita heaven, which is the heaven of complete contentment. And so I'll teach you this. And so the next day, the Sangha gathers together on the full moon ceremony, and they enact the first Segaki. And Ananda is saved from losing his life. And it's said from that time, that method which the Buddha taught Ananda has been handed down for 2,500 years. And what we enact is that ceremony. And there's a sutra called Blazing Mouth Sutra, which you can go and read. And it tells the story and it tells about these rituals and how they're to be enacted. One thing that I didn't mention last week with that story is that in some cultures and in some practices with this, there's a very intimate secret thing which is made explicit. And that is that Enku, Blazing Mouth, is actually an emanation of Avalokiteshvara. And you can see this in the iconography where there's a beautiful picture in the museum in Kyoto that comes from ancient China, where there's Enku, Blazing Mouth, sitting in Zazen like a Buddha. And his whole insides are on fire. You can see his inside his belly and everything. It's really striking. And then up above his head, there's a kind of cloud, and then Avalokiteshvara sitting in the cloud. And iconographically, this is a very direct meaning. If you see a Buddha or a Bodhisattva that's in the crown or hovering just above the head of a being in iconography, it means that that being is actually that. You're seeing a face of that being. You're seeing a face of Avalokiteshvara, and in this case, the face is the hungry ghost, the king of the hungry ghosts. This is very interesting and important. The deep desires, the kind of hunger that's deep in our being, which plagues us in so many ways. It causes so many problems. It causes us to lose our life again and again and again. We don't stay alive to the world. We shut down. Right? We don't really live. And that's what these kind of insatiable appetites do to us. But at the same time, they are important. There's a fate. They are a face of compassion for a whole bunch of reasons. And that's what the study or the exploration of this mythology and this practice will lead you into. Right? Is what is the value of hunger? What is the value of longing? And oftentimes we come to practice without a really healthy respect for that. We think I'm gonna squeeze out the bitters. I'm gonna get rid of the bad stuff, right? And then I'll be good. It doesn't quite work like that. We can't just squeeze it out. So this delusion and this wisdom, in this case delusion, this hunger, this insatiable appetite, this burning mouth, and wisdom, which is the Buddha, Kuan Yin, or Avalokiteshvara, they're indivisible. And the story gives us that. It shows us. The Buddha doesn't say, let's go kick Enku's butt, right? There's no big YouTube line that's like, death match. Don't you hate that now? Whenever you're trying to look at news, it's always like, final death blow on Trump's, blah, 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 or whatever. And everything's trumped up to like the maximum thing. Right? It's none of that. Actually, the Buddha, it says we're whole. He brings Ananda back to a practice of wholeness, not how do we kick out delusion. They're actually going to make offerings to delusion. They're also going to say, these beings need nourished. And that's why they show up to us in these very ugly ways, because we don't know how to nourish them. It's a very deep teaching. And this is actually why there's a path. This is why there is the Bodhisattva path, the path of liberation, is because delusion and awakening are not separate. It's such a simple thing, but these days I've just been thinking about it so much, and I think probably every Dharma talk, I'll just say this probably for the next year, so sorry, you're going to hear it again and again. The Buddha didn't leave. The Buddha didn't wake up and be like, oh, got the ticket, I'm out of here, right? There are Buddhas that do that, called Pratyeka Buddhas. They're isolated Buddhas. And they're revered, but they're not the Buddha that we follow. That's not the path that we follow. The liberating path that we follow, that Buddha never left. Stayed right here with delusion. I love when in the Jukai ceremony at the end, that's a precept ceremony, there's a dedication of merit that's always read by the preceptor. And in that, it says there are these people who are becoming disciples of the Buddha in Shakyamuni Buddha in his land, called the land of suffering. It's known as the land of suffering. That's what our realm is known as. And the Buddha stays there. Buddha stays there. So when we take this spirit world, when we take Enku seriously, the spirit world can host a practice. And that practice can happen in many different ways. It happens in our deep heart and mind. It may show up in our dreams, our imagination. It shows up in myths. It shows up in stories. And it works on us there. What is it to consider your Enku and to not just think of him as an enemy? That already changes something. This can work within our meditation, within Zazen. What is it to not to try to divide out delusion and awakening in the practice of sitting upright? this famous line by Dogen Zenjin, the founder of our school in Japan, says we should set up delusion, we should set up practice right in the midst of delusion. I like to think of it as we take our sack of delusion, otherwise known as me, and I sit it up, right? I sit it up. It's practice. Delusion practices awakening. You don't practice as an isolated being that's trying to get rid of the delusion and get the awakening. Delusion practices. So you set it up. And he said, we should be enlightened before our own awakening. It's very challenging. Be enlightened before your own awakening. Set up the sack of poop. That's another ancestor said that. I didn't make it up. They usually use a different word, but it's not so polite. So we can also study it there, but we can also study it through ritual. Ritual guides us in how we live. And it's how we do the ritual that's really important, but it lives outside of the ritual. The ritual may be a fairly small amount of time and space, but the ritual orients something in our living. And that can happen just, we do the ritual one time, but for the rituals that are really important in a tradition, we do them over and over again. So like I mentioned earlier, the core of this ritual we do every weekday at the temple year-round. And then in October, we take up a fuller form of the ritual, which we do every day for the month of October. And then we do the full Seigaki for this Sunday. Actually, this year we're having a retreat that starts on Tuesday, so we'll do a full Seigaki from Tuesday all the way to Sunday. And Sunday will be the biggest one. You'll all come. And we'll have this ritual. We'll all do it together, and then we'll have lunch together, which is always very tasty, by the way. So in that repetition, there's a kind of circumambulating that's happened. This is one of the oldest ways to venerate, like a stupa of a relic of the Buddha would be a stupa that's built, and a relic would be placed, like a tooth, or in the earliest relics, actually footprints. So a place where the Buddha stepped, and then people would say, okay, build a little tent around it, right? So it doesn't get washed out in the rain. And then a stupa got built, and it preserved the footprints of the Buddha. So these kind of sacred places, this is way pre-Buddhist too, this way of venerating. You walk around and you let that thing be in the center and you walk around it. Think about that for a second. That's pretty radical. We're kind of, our inclination in self-grasping is for us to be at the center and everything to turn around us. This is like a spiritual Copernican moment. Right? It's like, oh, I'm not the center. Right? In a way I am. But in another way, to really know what the most important part of my being the center is, I need to look to something and let it be at the center. And so we walk around. So when we think about cyclical ritual, we think about ritual that happens again and again and again. It's like that walking around. We put the teaching, the value, the gateway that's presented in that teaching at the center, and we just do it again and again and again and again. And all the time in doing it, it's not that we just get better at it, although we have more insights, but we're giving something over to this gateway that's been entrusted to us. And that's a way that we care for the ritual. This is important because the medicine is whole. It's not a crowbar, right? It's the touch. I said that in this world of spirits, everything's touching. It's the touch of wisdom, which is the medicine in these practices. It's a whole different way of living. And that's why we call it a path. So, what is the ritual that the Buddha learned from Avalokitesvara, taught to Ananda, and comes down to us today? The long and short of it is offerings. Make offerings. And that oftentimes gets interpreted in that if you make offerings, it will accumulate merit, and then you can dedicate that merit to beings that need the merit and helps them overcome things. That's the way that it's commonly understood, and that's important. But I want to go kind of down another level and talk about what does it mean to say that offerings generate merit. Merit is liberation. And offerings lead us in a path of liberation. When we take up the study of the perfections, for example, which is one way to talk about the Bodhisattva path, the first thing on that list of 6 things, sometimes 10 things, sometimes 8 things, but the first one in any case is dana, or generosity. And almost always we think about this in terms of just how do I live my life generously? In a formal sense, it wouldn't be, people, if they hear that word like in the Chinese characters in Japanese are called ofusei, they wouldn't think like being nice to your neighbor or taking them a meal when they need something. That totally is generosity practice. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying what's on the front end in classical Buddhism is making offerings to the renunciate community, making offerings to other spirits and other beings. That's where the generosity practice is usually focused on, and this ritual is definitely one of those things. So I think there's some Segaki books that are here, and I don't know if there's enough for everyone to have their own. So if you just pass them out real quick, and we're going to read something together, which I don't know in your book what page it may be on. You guys got, it's just Segaki, right? Which you have? Okay. So, some people might need to share a little bit. So what I want to talk about today is this part of the reading which is called Evoking the Vow to Awaken. You can also grab these sutra books, if there's some sutra books up there. Those will also work. The sutra books up there as well. So just as they're getting the last few books out, I'll tell you that this writing, like I had mentioned earlier, was done by a monk named Menzan, who lived in the 1700s. And the practice has been handed down since the time of the Buddha. But Menzan was a great collector of how it is that we can perform various types of rituals. Right? And so Menzan collected those things and wrote about them and codified it. And this particular writing is his teaching about what we're up to in this ritual work. So it's followed by the core Dharanis, which I'll talk about in a second here, but he adds this on. My guess is because people forget very easily. Dharanis are like language of the spirits. And as such, that don't make any sense in the normal way that language makes sense. And so you have to learn another way to work with them. But then what happens is if people don't really learn that and they just learn to say them, then they forget what they're about, right? And so that's no good. So this is just all my imagination, but my imagination is this is what Menzan was finding. And so he said, we need to remind people what this is about. So let's chant this first, and then let's chant the Dharanis, which are the core of the ritual. So let's just read this together on the Invoking the Vow to Awakening. So by all the members of this assembly. Our hearts set on awakening, we offer this gift of pure food to you, hungry ghosts from every corner of the Dharma realm, from every country and land without number. You departed long ago, gathered here. Come all you spirits from earth gods of mountains and rivers to demons and wraiths of the barren waste. Accept this food given in love and compassion. We pray that each of you in turn offers this gift to all Buddhas, all holy ones, and sentient beings throughout space and time. May all be equally satisfied. May your bodies, nourished by this Dharani food, gain liberation and leave suffering behind. May you attain the joy of celestial birth. May you be delivered to one of the pure lands. May your heart be set on awakening, and may you practice the path of liberation. May you never stray from the path, but instead become Buddhas. On attaining the way, may you vow to liberate all others, and may you day and night without cease protect us, answering our prayers in full. We dedicate the merit of this gift of food to all sentient beings of the Dharma realm. May all beings live in harmony, and together with us may all dedicate these blessings to the pure spirit of suchness, to supreme all-knowing awakening. Together with all sentient beings, may we swiftly become Buddhas, and may we seek no further reward. With these words and rites to guide us, may all sentient beings swiftly become Buddhas. Pretty powerful three paragraphs. So there's stages in this. He's explaining like the stages of meeting these hungry ghosts. And the first is to ask them to gather, not to just be in the practice of keeping them at bay, right? But say, no, actually, I need to recognize you. You know, one of the disagreements I had with my teacher, there were very few, but I never actually got to argue with him about it, is he would say, see, this shows there's something wrong with Ananda. And my thing is, it shows there's something right with Ananda. That Ananda can meet Enku. Ananda knows something that the other members of the assembly haven't come to yet. And the Buddha does not admonish him. The Buddha says, don't worry. And then we have this practice which comes out of it. Right? So that ability to allow for the spirit to be seen. And then right away, there's an offering prepared. And you'll see this in the ritual. We make special offerings. But they're different than the offerings we often make. The offerings that we make to the Buddhas and ancestors and Bodhisattvas is usually prepared food. Well, it's always prepared in some way. Fruit is prepared by the world, by the gods of fruit. And so that's there. But, you know, like here, but there's cooked food in the middle, there's tea, there's caramel. You know, someone made that. Okay? So that's usually what we're making there. When we feed the hungry ghost, when we're making an offering, it's uncooked food. It's usually raw vegetables, it's grains, it's dried food. Cooked rice. There could be a big mound of cooked rice if it's in East Asia. Here we use a nice round loaf of bread. Okay? And the offerings are made in that way because right away, making the offerings, we say, we ask you to make an offering with this food which we offer to you. So it's symbolic to use this kind of food so that they make a preparation of the food and then offer it to all Buddhas, all holy ones, and sentient beings throughout space and time. Basically, everything, everywhere. And this is what the hungry ghosts don't get. They think nourishment is about getting it in their belly, right? And so the offering itself is wondrous. But then saying, don't just keep it for yourself. If you want real nourishment, you can't just clutch the thing you think you need and pull it close to yourself and try to just utilize it for your individual stomach. Right? May all people, may all beings be satisfied. And here Menzon calls this the true nourishment. He calls it, this is an interesting word, Dharani food. I said that Dharani is like a language of the spirit. We chant the great compassionate heart Dharani every Sunday. That Namu Karatanno Torayaya Namo Yabu. You can go look the meaning of that up. But the point of it is that was entrusted in that language, that spiritual language entrusted to the beings of our world to be able to understand compassion. And here he's saying, this food now is not just any old food. It's Dharani food. It's spiritual food. And because of that, there can be true nourishment. And the hungry ghosts can be liberated. And in their liberation, it's not just, okay, they're Buddhas now. He says, now take up the path. Right? When you can be liberated from those negative qualities of the hunger, now you can walk the path. Or you could say the walking the path is the liberation. And then please become Buddhas. And then care and guide for us. Okay? And then may all beings be beyond suffering. So this is a very radical thing. It's Enku becoming a Buddha. That's what the ritual is about. Not a banishment of the demon, but recognizing that Enku's heart is also part of this touching, and that a healing is possible. Now, if we look at the Dharani, again, which are this kind of spiritual incantations, in your book, I think it has all the names of them, doesn't it? So they've got great names. And part of the reason they have these great names is because they're written in Chinese. And in Chinese has this great quality where you can stack up a whole bunch of characters and it still keeps kind of like a little unit. But then you put it into English and it sounds like very so flowery. But they're all really important. So the first one, this 10 stages of the Dharani practice map on to what Menzan is saying. That's why Menzan wrote what he wrote. He was looking at these Dharani. So the first one, the Dharani for inviting the cloud-like host of spirits. This Dharani, no bobo hori yari tari tata gyataya, that is a spiritual incantation for saying spirits come together. And hungry ghosts, of course, but actually all kinds of spirits. This cloud-like, there's spirits everywhere. So come together. And then there's the Dharani for breaking down the gates of hell and opening throats. And notice here, opening throats and the gates of hell are the same thing for a hungry ghost. And that's true of us. That gate into ourself, if you think about what a throat, in terms of nourishment, what it is, this narrow passageway into our belly, right? When does it become the gates of hell? And when is it a gateway of freedom? That's what's happening in this incantation. The opening of that is saying, no, you're not locked in. You're not locked in. None of you are. But we think we are, right? And because we think we are, that becomes the gates of hell. And then the Dharani for sanctifying the food with the unimpeded radiance of innumerable virtues. This is the central Dharani. No makusara batata getabarishite on sambara sambara. If you were to do no other Dharani, this is the one that that is pointed out as being the one that needs to happen. And this is revealing what is the true character of the nourishment that we're offering. We see a grain of rice and we think, oh, it's just a grain of rice. But the sutras tell us that all of the Dharma realm, all of the cosmos is reflected there in a grain of rice. That's like really standard theology in Buddhism, by the way, okay? I mean, theology is kind of a tricky word. Right? The whole universe is there. So there's no such thing as just a grain of rice. That would be like saying, well, it's just the cosmos. Okay? So that's the truth about nourishment, is it's not about quantity. It's about anything contains everything. And so we're revealing that. So it says sanctifying the food with the unimpeded radiance of innumerable virtues. Maybe it's better to say the sanctification is simply recognizing the unimpeded radiance, right? The one grain of rice is all things. And then there's the Dharani of bestowing the ambrosial taste of the Dharma. Guess what that taste is? It's ambrosial taste. Yeah. What does it taste like? A peach? That would be my bet. A white peach. An Asian white peach. But actually here, it's fearlessness. The taste is fearlessness. That when we can approach things with the Dharma, then we can do it without fear. And then there's this very enigmatic Dharani for contemplating Vairocana through the graph heart on a disc of water. This is some esoteric stuff which I won't explain too much about. But Vairocana Buddha is the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, the Buddha that is the cosmos. Right? But the mysterious thing is that total expanse of being is reflected in, or is a grain of rice, a pool of water. And so in this practice, that's contemplated, and there's a character, a kind of a particular spiritual character. Bon is the name of it, which gets written over and over and over again by the head of the ritual, and it's written on the offerings and everything. That bon, no maksam manda bodanam bang, no maksam manda bodanam bang, bam 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 bam. That's Vairocana's heartbeat, and everything is recognized as being the heartbeat of Vairocana Buddha, and that's why it can be this kind of true nourishment, or this Dharani nourishment. I realize this is all a bit esoteric, but just stick with me. I won't go on forever. And then there's invoking the 5 Tathagatas. So this is like saying, oh, the Buddhas. This is in a lot of tantric Buddhism, there is a system of 5 Buddhas, which are used to identify different qualities and characters of awakening. And they appear in different places in different ways and have different functions. So here they show up as these 5 Tathagatas. We ask them, please help out. We need help. And the reason we need help is because we have now fed these beings and they are ready to take up the path. They need guidance of the Buddhas. And so after we recite these incantations of the 5 Tathagatas, then is the Dharani for producing the thought of enlightenment. Doesn't this sound like something you might hear sometime? Om Bodhicitta Bodhahadayami. Bodhicitta. 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 This is the Japanese mispronunciation of the Chinese mispronunciation of the Sanskrit's mispronunciation of whatever the Dharani came in originally. Okay, so Om Bodhicitta Bodhahadayami, the Om Bodhicitta Bodhicitta. So this is an incantation for the arising of the thought of enlightenment, and this is why the Doshi says it, or the head of the ceremony says it, and then the assembly says it back. So in next week's ceremony, I'll say Om Bodhicitta Bodhahadayami. And then you'll say, Om Bodhicitta Bodhahadayami. And that call and response is like it's different than just saying the incantation. It's now there's a participation. The spirits are participating in the ritual. They're not just being fed. They're not just receiving. Now they're working together with us, right? And our voices become their voices. The spirits that come through me now are giving the thought, rise to the thought of awakening. And then the next one, the Dharani for giving the Bodhisattva Samaya precepts. This is Samaya, Om Sammaya Satobang, Om Sammaya, Samaya. Samaya is like path of practice, like a discipline of awakening. Right? That's what Samaya means. Here we take Bodhisattva precepts. That is a way that we're initiated into a path. You don't have to take that initiation to walk the path, but it is a support. So here in this, the spirits take that initiation through this incantation. And so the Doshi says, Om Sammaya Satoban, and everyone says, Om Sammaya Satoban. And we usually say it 3 times, although technically I could go on for a long time, just depending on what I feel in the moment. Usually I feel 3. So we'll see what will be next week. And then the secret root Dharani for dwelling in the great jeweled pavilion. So through doing this practice, now there is dwelling in the jeweled pavilion, which is dwelling in a pure land, dwelling in a place where awakening is happening. So now that's where these spirits are. And then there's the Dharani for initiating into the mantra of the radiance of the Buddhas. So this is that total radiance which is present in awakening. And then you'll see at the very end, I go like this. That's the mantra of liberation. And I'll go like okay? So this is what's happening in that. And we try to do it slow enough that everyone can participate in saying all of these mantras together. And we prepare the offerings together and we do all of that. And then we share a meal together. That's really fun to share a meal together, but it's not just because it's fun and tastes good, but it's also part of the offering. That's the point. Your offering of awareness and sisterhood and brotherhood with the people who have come together here is equally as important as all of the ritual work we do. That we care for each other by making that offering and receiving the offering, and knowing that that helps us make our vow for awakening and walking the path, and our own transformation comes through that. So it's quite miraculous, and The last thing I'll say about this is, I said last week I would talk this week about how do we work with our deep hunger. This is how we work with it, right? And I want to encourage you that there is some principles at work here, the principles of offering and the principles of non-division and the principles of wholeness and the principle of a broad and clear heart. And you can think about those principles and apply them in your life. And as you do this ritual work, as you hear these stories, as it works through you'll start seeing like, oh, I can do this differently. The principle starts to become clear. And we should also take the medicine as prescribed. Don't think that the principle is what the ritual is about. The ritual can't be reduced to a principle. But we do that almost automatically. You're doing it now, I'm quite sure, even if you're not aware of it. And that's not bad, okay? I'm not saying that's bad. And that's part of how we learn and how the whole thing deepens. But don't eject the practice itself because you can see the principle of it. Take the practice of it seriously. And for some people, that's once a year. We do Segaki together. And some people will come and ask me, they say, oh, can I come to the weekly ones? I'm like, of course, you can always come. To the practice that we do evening service every day. And some people say, oh, I want to do this at home. Oh, great, do it at home. I can show you some ways to do that. There's simplified ways to do it that's not as ornate. Or just come back to the simple practice of offering. Pour a little tea and put a little bit of your cereal in the bowl and give it to the Buddha, right? Give it to the spirits of your life. It doesn't have to be complicated. And in that actuality of that practice, actuality I'm saying here that you're doing it, not only extracting a principle from it, you'll find a really different thing opens up because the way that you see starts to change. Right? Working with a principle, that can also happen. Any questions? Hi.
Last week while we were going home, Ian, who's going to be 5 in February, asked me, we were talking about Segaki, and he said, will there be ghosts there? And I said, yes. He said, oh, will they be flying around the room? And I didn't quite know what to say. I guess that's my question back to you, and especially as it relates to encountering, or I can't remember exactly what word you used. But I'd also like to specifically ask about how to explain that to, how do we teach that? As a parent, or as somebody in the community who's with children.
So I feel like it's really important for us to take seriously the shape of the heart of all beings, all humans, but particularly children. They have a capacity and a fragility that is not worked with very well in general, I think. We kind of pour a lot of junk in there without thinking about what we're doing. So one of the first things that on a tone level, when I'm talking about ghosts or ogres or demons or any of those kinds of things with children, especially younger children, I soften my tone and I talk about it in a very matter-of-fact way, as opposed to a kind of like elevated sort of a way, because they will be elevated about it. So I might say something like, well, yes, actually, these kind of beings are around a lot, and it's fine. But in the ritual, we can do something to help them figure out how to live better. And so you probably won't see one, like in the sense of like a literal, like one will appear in your eyes. But even if you don't see it, there's something that we can do to be nice to them. There's something that we can do to help them. And so that's why we're kind of doing this ritual. So I kind of tried to de-escalate a little bit the kind of fear that will be around it and give a kind of a general broad answer like that, but not tell them it's just made up, or it's not really real, we're just kind of playing at something, you don't have to worry about it, because they know that's not true. And they may stick with it for a while. They may like, my mom said there's no such thing, so I'm going to stick with it. But on another level, these things are alive. We can't really get away from them. So I think that's kind of the important principle for ourselves. As we're exploring it in our own consciousness, there are so many different constitutions. Those of you who have more of an imaginative constitution, and what I mean by that is that images are important to you and maybe they come easily. Some of you might even be people who are given to visions, meaning that you see things in waking life like you would see in a dream, or in a dream you see certain visions. Take them seriously. Like, that's one of the things that was great about Ananda, is he wasn't like, no, there's no such thing. He was like, no, this is like, Inku's really giving me a message here. That's different than trying to talk about them as if they existed in the subject-object world. Right? It's a different thing. Now, is that a Venn diagram? Is there some overlap? I think probably there is, but maybe we won't have to talk about that right now. But generally speaking, I realized I don't need to make them empirically real for them to have significance. Right? For those of you who are less image-driven, maybe it's speech, maybe it's like words, right? Or maybe it's feelings. Maybe you have a certain kind of feeling about something. All of those are ways that these spirits they really come through all of our sense gates. And so we can appreciate them as being alive there without reifying them. Reifying meaning like putting a lot of effort into making them real. We don't need to do that. Just appreciate what they're telling you in a kind of direct way. And that can be a little scary. And it's also why the rituals are articulated in a certain way. And if you do get into that practice a little bit and you see scary things, come to the temple because there's spiritual help that's available for that. And and that's important that that in the taking it seriously, we're also vulnerable in a certain way. So we should recognize that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's also something about sort of the culture that exists broadly, and sort of what is different about this and how to transmit that to a child. I guess that maybe you could speak a little bit to that too.
Yeah, I would say one of the big things is that mostly the way that we talk about ghosts or those sorts of things is always pretty much always is either just being lampooned or kind of cute and fun, or it's like this treacherous and not common situation. But in the Buddhist cosmology, it's just part of everything all the time. And so I think that's a part that really transmitting is what I'm trying to put a lot of energy in when I give these kinds of talks, is to think about the spirit realm as just really, when you see a river, I was talking about, and you just know. It's like the river and the spirit of the river are not two, and that spirit's in me and I'm in it. And that's going on everywhere all the time. So that's the part that I think is really, that's why I started with tone, because it's like, how do we appreciate that? One thing that I do a lot, just myself, but do with my kids and now with my grandson a lot, is we make offerings. And we make gasho and we bow to things, not only Buddhas, but trees and, after you go in restroom, or all kinds of things, and appreciating the spirit in it. Then it's or like going to, my kids, going to their great grandparents' grave when we were living in Japan, and they go and you light a stick of incense and you put your hands together and you just talk to great grandma, and it's like it's very important, but it's not a big deal. Like, it doesn't become this other thing, and that kind of day-to-day work with spirit, I think, goes a long way. How do we appreciate the tree? The tree's also alive, like those kinds of things, or a bull. You know, I love my grandson. He plays with things, and then he'll put it, like when he's putting it away, he'll say, "Okay, let's play again later." You know, because he's at that age where the things aren't things, right? Which is so great. They are also beings, and so, you know, he's whatever it is, whether it's his like Tonka truck or it's an acorn or whatever, and then he'll put it and he'll say, "Okay, let's play again later." He'll put it, and that really teaches me a lot. How often I'm like, "Okay, done with that. Put it over here."
Kojo-san,
Hi.
I have a sort of related kind of question, or more of a comment, I suppose, but I feel that in sort of Western empirical scientific culture, this idea of a ghost or demon, part of the narrative or the popular narrative is that we as humans do not have agency in that realm.
Yeah.
So we're always victimized
by
this spirit or this ghost. And I think the heart of this practice has always felt to me that actually no, there's a very clear thing that we do. And I suppose it's hard to believe that for a long time it was hard for me to believe that in a serious way. That, I can when I make that offering of tea and cereal, something is actually happening. But I guess if I had a question of that is, how do we cultivate that? I want to use the word belief, but I feel like there's a better word, but I'll just use it. How do we cultivate that belief for ourselves and for, let's say, children?
So, when I was in Peru a couple months ago, I was entrusted with this conch shell, which is a kind of trumpet you blow made from a shell. And some people say conch and some people say conch. I don't know which it is, but I say conch and conch. So entrusted with this, and then the shaman who I received it from was encouraging me to blow it every day at the temple. And I said, okay, great, that's good. And that makes sense to me. I was looking for a practice, you know, it's just Soto Zen. It's like, I don't want to just know stuff, I want to practice. And she said this interesting thing to me. She said, you know, you have to learn to blow it, but really what you have to do is you have to blow from the heart. And she kind of touched me here in the heart. And so that's how I'm learning to blow that. And it's very interesting in blowing it that way. It's like there's this, you know, a trumpet like that is so interesting because it's just empty space. You know, it's like a hole and a spiral of empty space. And then there's this whole world of spirits that that conch shell is about. And so if you know, like I'm not so good at it. They say it's going to take at least a couple years, you know. So you're getting the sound going, but it's like you just know something in the doing of it that is like a doorway. That's why I say it's like empty space. It's like you could just see through. So in the practice of it is feeling for that. So when you make the offering, if you make the offering and you're like, did it get there? 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 You can't really feel that. It's about bringing the sincerity of your offering forward, even though you don't, you know, you might feel awkward about it. You don't really know what's happening, but you just come with that kind of level of childishness, you know, without knowing a bunch of things or expecting that you'll be verified, and that's what it means to make an offering. Yeah, and feel for that place where it's just like, oh, and you can see through. And I'd say this is another thing. My teacher was so kind. I would go on and on and on about how stupid I thought it was that Japanese Buddhism was so wrapped up in funerals all the time, and shouldn't people be sitting zazen and blah, 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 blah. And his whole job for like a long time, 70 years, was mostly doing funerals. But he would just listen to me and agree with me. He'd be like, yeah, it'd be great if more people sat zazen, da, da, da. And one day he said, you know, Ejo, when people lose someone, that's when the medicine can really go in deep. And I never said anything again, even in my own head. I was like, yeah, it's true. And so the reason I bring that up now is when you come across the inevitable deep and difficult pain of loss, this is especially important time to be feeling for that doorway and paying attention to it and making offerings. And you will know something that isn't really explainable. You don't have to wait for that, but those times in particular, pay attention. It's why in East Asian Buddhism, a lot of people say, but well, Chinese ancestral worship got mixed up with Buddhism, and it all got kind of like, mixed together as if you could extract one from the other. I get so kind of sick of that sort of way of thinking about the world. Well, maybe people found out that caring for your ancestors actually had something spiritually significant about it, rather than it was all mixed up, right? And I believe that's true. So for your family, for people you've known who you've lost, for your community, to make those kinds of offerings and to chant a Dharani. You don't need a conch, you have Daishin Dharani. You have the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. And if you just recite that, if you can't recite the whole thing, if it feels like too much, just do a couple lines and feel for that enactment of compassion. And feeling is very different than evaluating, right? You're not evaluating whether you've done it well or not, or if it feels right or not. You're not evaluating it, you're feeling. Like if you're going to ride a bicycle and you're evaluating whether you're balancing or not, you fall off. You have to actually feel for what the balance is. And so that's what I'm recommending. Great, well, we better get to some cookie eating.